G'day, Bob. Bob
Hi.
Burton. How are things in Tassie?
Oh, nice and warm. Beautiful sunny day.
Really? In
Clear
Tasmania?
skies over Coonawney, Mount Wellington.
Wow, wow. Well, you've got to take that one. We always think it's cold down there.
It sometimes
uh,
is.
can you just briefly outline what you were doing about 5 years ago before you founded Tasmanian Inquirer? Yeah, what was your your journalism at that stage?
Well, for the previous 20 years or so, I'd been freelancing for a range of outlets, everything from British Medical Journal through to do a weekly bulletin on the global coal industry for a US nonprofit. And I'd done various bits and pieces on Tasmanian issues over the years as well. But there was a gap, we could see that the local media industry was in a state of, particularly the print mastheads, was in a state of decline, less journalists, less stories being covered, people under pressure to do a lot with very little time. So there was a gap for us. And so all three of us, Mark Horseman, Adam Morton, and myself, had been were freelancers at the time. And we thought, look, there's a space to do something else. Nobody else is going to do it. So there's no point sitting around grousing about what others aren't doing. So we thought, and the beauty of the digital landscape is that you can start up a masthead without a huge overhead. So we're blessed with those benefits, whereas others didn't have that 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, mate, it sounds like an idea that came together after a long lunch or over a couple of beers. Is that what
Well,
happened?
I used to convene a gathering of freelance journalists for that were MEAA members, but loosely anyway. And so we all got together at a couple of those, and we were chatting about things, and essentially that was where the kernel of the idea came from that.
So did you feel, and you and the others felt that there wasn't enough accountability journalism being done in Tassie, that perhaps companies and politicians were getting away with misdeeds, corruption, and so forth?
Well, I think there's been three broad trends you'd say that created the space for us. The first was less and less journalists, particularly at the newspapers, which used to be really quite strong watchdog accountability journalism across Tasmania. The Advocate, the Examiner, and the Mercury. They've all suffered, significant cuts in staffing. We've also had the rise of the PR and lobbying industry in the state, and their clients tend to be those who've got deep pockets. So companies and industry associations have got greater capacity to spin their line. And the same has been true of government, where they've invested more and more resources into media management as well. So the intersection of those three trend lines means that there's a much, much less accountability journalism. It's much easier for companies and governments to bury all sorts of scandalous stories. And in the past, where it used to be, the Age had a stringer down here. It was, Tasmanian stories would often get a run in the mainland and then be imported into Tasmania. A lot of those sort of, those pathways are a lot weaker than they used to be. So, there was a significant space for doing something that was filling some of the gaps.
Yeah, and it's just it's bad for democracy when there isn't that kind of accountability. And as you say, the growth of the spin and public relations, and now also misinformation and disinformation just seems to be growing exponentially, whereas serious media, generally speaking, seems to be in a bit of decline at the moment.
Yeah, and yeah, a significant proportion of those journalists, for example, particularly at the newspapers, they're under pressure to do two, three, four stories a day.
Yeah.
And anything that takes more time to dig out stories, to go out to various, remote locations and check out, make connections with people, that just takes time, and we need more resources put into those sorts of things. I mean, we're time constrained, but at least we've got the freedom of being able to pick stories that nobody else is doing, really.
Yeah, so it's notoriously difficult to set up a independent news organisation in Australia. particularly one that's doing investigative stories. What were the key challenges you and the others faced?
It took a little bit of time to nut out, some of the technology issues about platforms and design, and there was no easy idiot's guide to doing that. Um, and a bit of it was about getting a reasonably good handle on what others were doing and what they weren't doing. So figuring out where the space was, where we would have, we can contribute something unique, because our model was very much, we're not going to rely on advertising on the website. There's a bunch of reasons for that. And if we're not, and it's got to be open access, we're appealing to people who like what we do to chip in, and that makes it free for all. So there aren't that many models for that, let alone at a relatively small independent scale. In the US and Canada, and to a degree in the UK, there's not-for-profit models and there's philanthropic funding, whereas that doesn't really exist anywhere near the same scale in Australia.
Yeah, it's a shame that we don't have tax deductibility for news organisations, particularly serious ones. The growth of those in the United States, as I've mentioned before, is has been phenomenal and just great for democracy. It's one thing that seems to be inhibiting. I guess the politicians just don't find it within their own interest to have that kind of multimedia outside of the mainstream growth in that particular area.
Yeah, and look, I think there's a couple of strands to that. I mean, one is I think their challenge is that they don't quite see what it could be like. Those who pay attention to see what
Hmm.
groups like ProPublica and Mother Jones and a whole bunch of others that are effectively tax sort of set up as non-profits. They have a huge contribution in the US, and it's growing, and particularly at lots of local regional levels. Whereas here, I just get the sense that the bureaucracy and most politicians don't quite grasp it. They don't see what's happening elsewhere, and they can't quite envisage what it would look like in Australia. I think we'll get there sooner or later. It'd be nice to see it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's really a good point that they just see Four Corners and the nine papers doing stuff, and they think, oh well, been let's move on, been there, done that. When in fact, local community-based investigative journalism is hard to find unless it's a kind of a national issue. Just coming down to funding, so there's no advertisements, there's no paywall or sponsorship, and you're taking donations. Is there enough money to get by? And who are the most likely donors in terms of what's already happened?
Um, well, it's a mix of people that have known one or all of us for many years, who are, know us as individuals, so want to support our work. And then it tends to be a bit of a random mix of people who stumble across one or more of our articles on different topics, and then just see a pattern of we're doing something that nobody else is doing. And people get onto the email list, and then sometimes it seems a bit random. Of you do one story, and then suddenly there's a flood of donations, and you just think, well, I'm not sure that story was all that much better than lots of the other ones, but I think it's a cumulative thing. People see that you're doing stuff, and then thinking, good on them for having a crack, and it's we'll chip in. So it's I don't think there's any great science to it.
Yeah.
I think it's the more people see that we're doing, I think there's a degree to which there's a level of validation for what we do too. We've been, for a 5-year-old organisation, we've material we've published has won 3 Tasmanian Media Awards, and been finalists in another 7 categories. So, we've got something of a track record that's a bit externally validated, and people think, well, good on them for having a go.
Sounds like you're punching above your weight, really.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, we'd be the smallest newsroom in the state, and there's been some significant stories that we followed where we can demonstrate that we've had impact on legislation and public debates and corporate behaviour, and often those things are pretty hard to tie down. or often very nuanced, or it takes ages for you to be able to look back and say, I think that started here.
Yeah.
So, we're pretty chuffed that our concept of how we think it could operate has been, proven. And it's a matter of the next challenge really is sort of starting to scale it up and getting a bit bigger and doing some more ambitious projects.
That's fantastic. And what are some of the stories that come to mind, and what areas are you specializing sort of in, or focusing particularly on particular areas, or just general stories, and maybe give us some examples.
Yeah, broadly, we've sort of narrowed our focus. We sort of badge it as, politics, environment, society. We don't try to cover sport. There's lots of other media sites that are doing lots of stuff that we just can't see. There's no point asking people to fund you if you're doing what they can get elsewhere. So the sorts of stories we've done have been, we've done a whole series on political donations reform. We've covered it in more depth and more consistently than any other media outlet. It's been a long-running debate about the need for reform in Tasmania, and then finally, we've had 2 rounds of legislation go through the Parliament, and the first phase of that comes into effect on the 1st of July. And we know that we've shaped shaped the debate about that and had an impact on the actual detail of legislation. Done a fair bit on the salmon industry, particularly the debate over the use of explosives against seals, underwater explosives to deter seals at salmon farms, on the use of antibiotics and the reports about antibiotic contamination of wild fish turning up kilometres away from the fish farms. So there's been issues like that where we were sort of early onto the topic. Another one we've sort of been tracking more recently is ministerial appointments diaries, and how the government is not really doing those properly and not providing as much detail as they should. And then this week we did one on we've got 3 legislative council elections coming up tomorrow. And we did one story on how there was this $450,000 grant to a small community organisation in one of those electorates, and just the process by which that suddenly got turned around within the space of 2 weeks after the federal election.
Okay, they sound great. Well, just what's the seal story? I think that struck a
Uh, so,
bell for
so
me.
there's
That it-
one of the issues that many of the salmon farms is that seals come in, break into the pens, and it's like a buffet food for them. They just hang around there, and it's a lot of free food.
right.
And so they can they break through the nets. They can get a lot of fish. They can let fish out. Um, so there's been this long running saga about how does the industry deal with it. They used to shoot them. Then they went through a phase where they'd capture them and relocate them, and that was proved entirely counterproductive. And then more recently, for the last decade or so, they've been allowed to use 3 different devices to either shoot at seals, like beanbag. They call them beanbag rounds, like
Mhm.
lead shot in a Hessian bag. And another one are called they refer to them as sea crackers, but that understates the potential damage that they can do. It's basically underwater explosives. So they can throw them at the seals in the hope that they scare them off, and there's all sorts of consequences from that. But after we got the data on that about which companies were using these explosives and how many per month, we published that. We got those records under right to information legislation. After we published that, suddenly the use of those explosive devices against seals has declined dramatically in the last 2 to 3 years.
Right. Fantastic. So you're having an impact.
Yep, yep.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. What can you give some? Do you keep any metrics or views, or how do you measure? You know, how it's all going, Tasmanian Inquirer.
Well, look, for us, there's a bit of a trap if we got fixated in page views and the like. We think that's a bit of a wrong metric, because sometimes we'll do a story and it'll go really well, and other
Yep.
times you think this is an even better story and it doesn't.
Mm.
So if you start selecting stories about how you think it's going to go, you'll probably be wrong.
Yeah.
And then we've got slightly different metrics. We've had about, I think it's 9 or 10 of our stories that have been republished by The Guardian. So that's extended our reach
Okay.
dramatically. Um, uh, so and as I said before, some stories will prompt a lot of donations and others won't. So we tend to think, well, there's no point being trying to be too predictive about measuring metrics. What's more important is to build and extend what we're doing. If we can build the size of our mailing list, if we can increase the number of donors that we've got, and just keep on doing good work, then it starts help building the base, and that's proven to be true so far. I mean, it'd be nice to be double or triple our size, but these things take time.
Yeah, and it always fascinates me how local media don't tend to follow up their competitors' so-called stories. Are you finding that the media that is there is following some of your news breaks?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And again,
Right.
there's no, there's no obvious rhyme or reason to it sometimes. So like for example, last year I did a story about um, got some records under Right to Information Act about there's a manganese smelter up in the north of the state, heavy polluter. We got the records about what are the requirements under their rehabilitation plan, because if they go bust, there's no rehabilitation bond. What are we going to be left with? And so it was a really solid story. It's one that we're a finalist in two categories at the Tasmanian Media Awards next week, and that's one of those stories. But as far as I can tell, no local media in the north of the state actually followed up on that. And to me, it's been a solid performer for us on our website. And I suspect what's happened is there's a lot of people in the local community who want to know what's going on, what the issues are, and we're the only place they can find anything about it.
Yep.
So sometimes you just think, if I was a journalist in the north of the state, I would have thought that's a gimme. It's
Yep.
all the hard work has been done. There's a really solid story there. There's lots of angles to follow up that we didn't cover in the first round.
Mm.
But I don't understand why that wouldn't get a follow. But anyway,
Yeah. Yep. What about defamation, mate? I mean, investigative journalism can be pretty fraught at times. How do you go about legaling stories or dealing with legal threats?
one of our some people would look at us and just think, well, you only do one or two stories a month. That's a bit of a weakness, isn't it? Because you're not doing enough volume. But we've sort of look at those instead of as being a weakness as a strength. It gives us the time to make sure the story is right before we go to publication, to fact check everything, to make sure all of us are happy with it. And if any of us have an issue, then we've got a pro bono legal advisor who we can run stuff past. I think we've only ever checked two or three stories where there were little things that we weren't quite sure about. The rest of the time is, all three of us are very experienced, and so we've got reasonably finely attuned a tenor. So if there's anything we think is problematic, then there's usually a way around it.
Yeah. Well, I wish we could carbon copy you and Tasmanian Inquirer and put it around regional centres and in Australia, because I think that'd be a wonderful thing for democracy and the democratic processes. Where can viewers or listeners find it? Find the
Just
publication.
Tasmanian Inquirer, www.tasmanianinquirer.com.au.
All
And,
right.
and and just on that last point, I mean, I think there will be a lot more digital newsrooms just like us. I think if we look 5 or 10 years ahead, um, we will look a bit like just a very small part of the landscape. So I think it's emerging. It's just taking longer than we'd like.
Yeah, I hope you're right. Certainly, outfits such as yours and others didn't exist, 5 years ago, perhaps. And I really hope it is the start of a trend, and I hope that foundations, philanthropists, and civil society comes and throws in a few bucks. That would be terrific, I think.
It would.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too, mate.